Game over. Game over. Lights out. You've just been completely obliterated publicly. With
Cool.
your wait, you've been caught. You've been folded like a chair, caught with your pants down. The scenarios are impossible, right? It could still be the case that Cartesian scenarios are possible, and God is justified in appealing to those seemings, right? But the argument doesn't rest upon one theory of justification because maybe you want to say something like, even if he's justified, um, that means he knows that he isn't a brain in a vat. Yeah, you might want to say that, but even if he knows that he's not a brain in a vat, it's not like he necessarily knows that he's not a brain in a vat. Because if
If he's
there's an
omniscient,
argument,
then he does necessarily know that.
well, I mean, that's just, I mean,
Not
again,
begging the
Well,
question.
that's
well,
just affirming,
yeah,
yeah,
let's just,
that's just affirming that if he knows all true propositions, it's entailed that he necessarily knows all true propositions,
yeah,
which are
but
two different things.
let's,
You can
well,
know,
let's,
you can know all true propositions, and it's still being possible that you don't know all true propositions, right?
Can you explain that?
yeah,
That doesn't make any sense.
how does that follow?
Look, God knows all true propositions, right?
This
But he
is this
doesn't.
is
Yes,
a this is a
But
necessarily.
recorded
he
conversation.
doesn't know them. He doesn't know them in all possible worlds, right? There's still a world where he doesn't know the truthhood of a particular proposition P, right?
No,
Oh, so he does necessarily know all true
that's
propositions?
what omniscience is. See, this is why this argument is sneaky, because you're speaking about an omniscient God, and halfway through you automatically assume that this God's not omniscient. It's
How does
arguing a
that
different
follow?
front. It's arguing against a different
No,
front.
it is no. Look. When the premise goes, if Cartesian scenarios are possible, then omniscience is impossible. How omniscience is defined in that premise is God necessarily knowing all true propositions. That's the definition used. So it's not actually using a different definition of omniscience, right, that you might have in mind.
It's not the definition of omniscience. It's if this God is omniscient, there is no Cartesian scenarios that's possible for this God.
No, but that's just to deny internalism, and that's to deny all the other
It's
premises.
not to deny internalism. How does that follow? How does that logically follow?
Oh, it does, because look, if
Well, I
you're
mean, yeah,
gonna want
that's
to
a claim.
say
Do you have an
if you're
argument?
gonna want to say something like God knows all true propositions in
Yes.
all possible worlds,
Uh huh.
that's already assuming that there couldn't be one possible world where the scenarios don't apply to God, or they're just
Let's make this
straightforwardly
simple.
false. But
Let's make this.
that's what's in
Hold on,
contention,
hold on, hold on. Let's
right?
make this simple. Is God is deceived? Could that be a true proposition?
God can be deceived. Well, I mean, depending
Is
on
that
the characteristics of that God, that could be a
uh huh?
true proposition.
Okay. What if the characteristics of this God is omniscience? Could this God? You would say that it's still a true proposition that the God could be deceived.
It's still a true. Well, I mean,
If God is an omniscient being, and by
yeah.
omniscience we
Well,
say we
depending. It sounds like you're trying to say it's just analytically false that God can be deceived because God is
correct,
the
because if
type of
God's deceived,
entity that
if
necessarily knows all true. Yeah, but that's if
hold
you
on,
just say,
let me explain it. But you
look,
keep saying yeah, but, and then you say something else, and then you say yeah, but, and then say let me respond. If God's omniscient, then He knows all true propositions. If God's deceived, then He would know that He's deceived, which means that He would know how to not be deceived, which means that God could not ever possibly be deceived because He's omniscient. It
well,
just doesn't logically follow.
well, I don't see how I didn't quite catch that, but look, the whole point is that even if you say that God is omniscient, right, it doesn't pose a problem to internalism per se, or at least it sounds like you want to say something like, if he necessarily knows all true propositions, then there's not one logically possible world where God is incorrect that he's not a brain in a vat. But
Yeah,
you
but what
see,
we're asking is
even when you
what's the
argue that, there's two things a
I don't
problem
need to
with.
argue that.
No, look. There's two things wrong with that. Number one, the first thing
I'm
that's
not
wrong with
arguing
that
that. So
is
who
that
are you
it's
saying?
presuming it's presuming that Cartesianism is false, right? And God cannot know false propositions.
How
God
does
can
that
only know
follow?
true propositions.
You keep making claims. Do you have arguments for these claims?
No, I do have arguments for these claims.
Okay, so then
It just
provide an
follows. It
argument.
just follows. It just follows that no entity can know a false proposition.
Is that your argument, or is that just another claim?
Knowledge is a justified true belief. How can you know a false
Correct.
proposition?
Yes, knowledge is a justified true belief, and if God has knowledge of all true propositions, if God is deceived, he would have knowledge of that deception. I don't
Yeah,
think you can get
okay,
past this.
but you're saying that he couldn't know that he isn't BIV because BIV's it's a true proposition that BIV scenarios are impossible.
What
But
are
you have to show
BIV
an argument.
scenarios?
Brain event.
Oh, BIV. Okay. Yeah, but if God was a brain in a vat, and that's a true proposition, would he not have knowledge that he's a brain in a vat?
Well, he would have knowledge if only if BIV scenarios were true, right? If he knows all true propositions and it's a true proposition, say he's a BIV, even under your view, he would know that. But you're saying
Correct.
he
Yeah.
wouldn't. He's not incorrect that he's not a BIV because BIV scenarios are false, right? They don't apply to God. But then you would have to give an argument, right, as to why they're false or impossible.
But wait. Before we get to me providing arguments, how does it necessitate that I have to throw away content internalism? Like how is it necessary that I have to throw that away in this scenario?
Well, because when you say something like God necessarily knows all true propositions,
Uh-huh.
is it under your view that the meanings of the words within that proposition are referring to something in the external world?
No.
Like if he is,
No,
well,
the
how
external
so,
world,
right?
the conception,
If God has
prop.
not, if God has foreknowledge
See, this
that
is
his
what you do.
agents would sin, right? How is the referent picking out something that isn't in the external world or
Okay,
possibly in
so
the external world?
I'm not sure what any of that meant, but what I'm going to say
Look,
is that God
it's a
has.
simple
Hold
question,
on,
right?
hold on, hold on. This
If
is
God
not an
has
atheist room.
foreknowledge that
You
agents will
guys take
sin,
over in your
how does
atheist
that
rooms. You're not going
referent
to do
not
it
pick
here.
out the external?
Okay, so anyways, what I was saying was that I believe in internalism because I believe that God necessarily knows of the external world prior to creating it because the external world comes from God. So the concepts or the proposition of the external world existing would come from God, which means that he would be able to have knowledge of it internally. There's that. There's omniscience, knowing all true propositions. If there was an external world, God would know about it. If there was something that would deceive him, he would also know about that, by definition, being an omniscient being. I just don't see how this argument, just
No,
halfway through, goes from, okay, we're talking about an omniscient God to talking about a non omniscient God.
no,
It's sneaky. It
wait,
doesn't make any sense.
wait. Can you respond to the question I posed to you?
What's the question?
Does he have knowledge of future tense propositions?
He has knowledge of, yes, future tense propositions, correct.
Okay, is it a future tense proposition from God's perspective that agents will sin, for example?
That agents will sin, yes. But here's my thing.
Yeah, so how is
Are
that
we now? Now,
not
hold on.
picking
Are
anything
we
out in
now
the world.
admitting that the original argument that's posed is not good enough, and now you need to bring up other
No,
arguments
no,
to
no,
try
no.
and
It's
substantiate it?
related. It's related. So, right. So when God has foreknowledge that agents will sin, how is the meaning of that word, of those words, right? Agents will sin. How is that not picking out any referent in the world apart from his mind?
Agents will sin. It's not apart from his mind. That's what you're not getting.
No,
Is
I'm
that if
not
there's
saying
not
that.
an
Look, is it. I'm not saying that's a part of mind. I'm saying, is that proposition referring to something that is.
yeah, I just don't see how this is following at all. We have to keep going down all these other side steps. You're jumping through hoops.
No,
This is
look,
mental
look,
gymnastics.
look. When he knows that agents will sin, right? Is that is the word agents picking out or referring to something external to himself?
God's thoughts are not linguistic. That doesn't make any sense.
That's
That's
what.
not what it's asking.
That's
There's not
not what
words
I'm
in God's
asking.
thoughts. You said the word agent,
Yeah,
right? Prior sans creation, right?
is that word picking out something
Words don't
in the
exist sans
external
creation.
world?
Ask that again.
Is that word referring to something external to God that isn't God? Is the word agents picking out something that isn't God in this context?
Yeah, I
Yes.
mean, so Detroit actually covered this though in the discussion. I know you were coming and going,
Hmm.
but I'm pretty sure that you heard him say that God could certainly be validating internally against other aspects of his knowledge, not just seemings, right? But against other types of knowledge. So
Sure. And
yeah, so it doesn't require it to be external. It can still be internal.
how does that follow? Look, you're just talking about knowledge. I'm talking about the meaning of this proposition, right? Those are two different things. When you say,
That yeah, the meaning would
The
be whatever
meaning of a
meaning,
meaning.
whatever ascription that God deems.
Yeah, but what
look,
what Darth seems to be asking is basically if the proposition is Rob will pick up a cup in 10 minutes, right?
is the
That
cup,
proposition is referring it,
is the word cup referring to something external from Rob
or from
In a
God.
future
in a
tense, in
future
a future,
tense? Okay, so when he has knowledge of that, is that knowledge referring to something in the world that's future tense?
if we grant and we say yes,
Yeah, so
what,
then that's just to say that the proposition that's true um, is something that would be true, right? Given that the meaning of the word is external from the agent uttering it, right? It's picking out something in the world as a reference, which is just to say that
no, because no, because
externalism
it's
would be
because
true
but
if and only if this proposition were true, right? And God has knowledge of that proposition.
he has knowledge of it because the entire scenario is only conceptual. The future doesn't exist. Nothing's been instantiated. It's entirely conceptual.
It's
So it's
entirely
got
conceptual. What does that have to do with anything?
it has to do with that the external world is conceptual before it's external. It's internally conceived.
Look, does he have it doesn't matter. Look, does he have foreknowledge of the external world existing sans
Yeah, but
creation?
yeah, even if he does,
Yeah,
it's on
Well,
but that doesn't
it's on the
engage
doesn't
ba-
with
matter
what
if
it's
he's
on
Brian
not
just
it's
there
on
said.
the
yet.
See,
basis
now
it's
you're
on the
skipping to
As
something
long
else.
as the meaning is referring to something external from God, right? Possibly speaking, that's still to affirm some sort of externalism. I don't get. Well, how is it relevant to say it's not there yet? I don't
it's
understand.
relevant it's relevant because everything that's external, if we're talking about future tense scenarios, everything that would be external is first internal. It's conceived in the mind of God before it's instantiated.
Well, I mean, that's just assuming that no externalism actually wouldn't apply here, just because his knowledge of the future tense propositions is just
Look,
referring to something internal. Yeah, but
look,
again, that's just assuming that no externalism isn't true if um, God's Son's creation exists without a world, right? But that's also what's in contention.
Are you saying that it's necessary that Cartesian scenarios exist?
No, necessary
Okay.
that they
All right,
exist.
cool.
They
Then
don't.
it's
They don't exist in all worlds. No,
perfect.
there's no
Look,
contradiction
look,
in denying them.
look, if we
But
conceive of
I
a
haven't
God,
heard a rebuttal as to how what the contradiction would be exactly.
look,
If all the
if
entailments follow from internal.
look, if we're talking about God sans creation as a mind, sans creation, then we are assuming that God is creator, and that what's going to follow from God is all logically necessary worlds, all worlds that he deems to be necessary, whatever he chooses to instantiate. There would then therefore be no possible scenario in which God would not be omniscient, number one. That's first and foremost.
There's no possible world where he wouldn't be omniscient.
Yes, because God would not choose to actualize any such world, so therefore it's not logically.
Plus, God
Yeah,
is
but
necessary, but
that's just
and by
sidestepping.
necessary
That's just
means that he.
sidestepping the issue, right?
It's not sidestepping. See,
Yes,
that's
it
the
is
thing. Is that every
sidestepping
time a good point is made up against this argument,
it.
you call it sidestepping or begging the question.
It is sides. Well, it is begging the
It's
question,
not
right?
sidestepping because if we're talking about a necessary being at the onset of the argument, a necessary being could not be different in another possible world. So when you have a premise that states that he could be different in another possible world, you're not talking about the
Look,
same thing anymore.
are are are
It's sneaky.
is that a proposition that's analytically true?
But see how we're asking questions like this. This
No,
is
no,
what's
it's
happening this whole
related.
time.
It's
No, no,
related.
you keep saying it's related. I don't see how it's related. Can you show me how it's related?
Does an omniscient being necessarily know all true propositions? Is that itself
We've
analytically
already
true?
said yes.
Okay, so yeah, so are analytic propositions tautologies?
I don't know how this is related. Can you explain to me how it's related?
Yeah, it's related, right? Because all you're saying is that an omniscient being is
That's
an
a tautology. It's
Are
related
you not
because it's
right.
accepting
related.
any? Are you
How
not
is that
accepting any
informative
tautology?
to the argument?
Are you not accepting any tautology?
Well,
Well, he just said one.
not
He
as a
said it's
contra
related because it's
argument.
related.
I
Not
think
Hold on,
as a
hold on.
counter
Hold
argument.
on, Darth. If I say I'm going to pay you with $1, is $1 a tautology?
What?
Oh my god. Look, all analytic propositions are going to be tautologies, right? They're going to be true by
This
definition.
is just sidestepping.
Okay? So when you say that the Cartesian scenarios are logically impossible, right? Because they don't apply to an omniscient being that necessarily knows all true propositions. That's just to say that the scenarios are impossible because they are impossible. They don't apply to this very entity. Yeah, but that's number one. That's the thing in contention. Number two, it's not what you're saying is not informative, right? You're not. You're just spouting off a tautology. Why should we even accept that? I could just say, well, it's true by definition that all atheist arguments are
You don't
sound.
have
This
to
is an
accept
atheist
it, but it
argument,
doesn't
therefore this
entail.
argument is
But
sound. Who
so it
cares,
does.
right?
You don't have to accept it, Darth. But that doesn't necessarily mean that you have provided an argument that. What the conclusion of this argument is, therefore, God does not exist.
No,
Right?
God can still exist but not be omniscient. You realize that, right?
So if at the onset of this argument we're talking
Maybe
about
not
an
your God,
omniscient
but
God, exactly. So if you're speaking with me and you say, "Do you believe in an omniscient God?" Well, I mean, honestly, would you just spout this argument to anyone, or would you actually find out if they believe in an omniscient God or not?
No, but what I think that this
At
is,
the
well,
beginning of the
I'm not.
argument, you would have this understanding that the person you're speaking with believes in an omniscient God. So is the
yeah.
conclusion of your argument that therefore this God does not exist?
Yeah, this God does not exist. Yeah.
Okay, so what entails from you just not accepting a premise or a explanation? What about that entails that this God does not exist just because you
Well,
don't accept something about it?
you're just trying to wiggle out of the scenarios
No,
because
we're
you
just
say it's
showing we're
analytically
just not
false.
falling for the sneaky procedure of the premises.
No, I think
You're just saying
it seems like
that the argument doesn't go through because it's analytically false. That God can be
No, it
deceived,
doesn't go through
right?
because it's dishonest.
An argument is dishonest, guys. Okay, there you go,
like
guys.
maybe I can chime in, but it seems to me like I'm not familiar with like the formal argument or anything. I'm just familiar with what I've heard here. So correct me if I'm wrong, but all Darth seems to be saying is that okay, there's this argument, and this argument seems to be putting into tension the property of omniscience with some other properties of God, which are like He's a mind and you know, and some properties of being a mind and having thoughts or beliefs or or about true propositions and stuff like that, right? And that's the only thing, right? You don't need to assume omniscience. All he's saying is that under this definition, if you believe God is a mind with these characteristics and also he's omniscient, then you're going to run into trouble, right? That's all he's saying, or well, at least that's what I'm hearing.
Yeah, but the problem is that nobody runs into trouble because at the beginning of this argument, he's speaking with someone who believes